Hey ecology students, welcome back. We are continuing with our ecosystem lecture. Whereas in the first part of our ecosystem lecture, we learned about different types of ecosystems. With this one, we are going to learn a little bit about how ecosystems work. Oh, and as you hear, Aries the cockatiel is on my head, so he is visiting me. Sorry for the interruptions. Um, so you have Whereas in community ecology, you wound up having different types of constructs on plants and animals and their relationships, and what plant is eaten by this animal and what animal eats this animal, like a food web or a food chain. We talk a lot about the abiotic components of ecosystems and how they allow an ecosystem to work. And Aries is talking a lot. Sorry, he's saying he's a pretty bird and birdo birdo. Okay, anyway. So we're going to talk about energy in an ecosystem, and energy is considered a condition, a non-living or abiotic component of any given ecosystem. So what you have is you have energy that is released by the sun. And we as humans are not able to directly convert that sun's energy to body mass or convert it to our own energy. But plants have the ability to do this remarkable feat through photosynthesis. And where you have more photosynthetic organisms or more plants, or otherwise known as more plants, or also more phytoplankton, although we're concentrating here on terrestrial ecosystems, you have more of an ability to fix that energy from the sun and turn it into usable energy for the food chain levels above that. And where more of this is taking place is what we would then term as being more productive. So those productive areas, again, those areas that are able to fix the sun's energy, occur in I should say the most productive are the tropical rainforests, as it goes to follow. More plants, more biomass of plants, the more productive that area is, and it's why these areas are the most biodiverse. Temperate forests come into a second, which sometimes surprises people, where we live. And that is because you have lots of different types of plants and lots of, like, for instance, grasses and trees. Northern coniferous forests are next. There are lots of trees there. They're the needle-like ones. And then your deserts, there are photosynthetic organisms there. And more so there than a tundra, but just not that much. So they tend to be the least productive as far as energy in any given ecosystem, as far as the base of the ecosystem. And as you recall, I mean, these might look familiar to you on the right-hand side. You say, oh, that looks like a food web, or that top demographic, or I'm sorry, the top graphic. And whereas you have a food chain that is represented with a flower and then a grasshopper, a mouse, and a snake, that is something we discuss in community ecology as far as specifically what eats what. Primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. But what we concern ourselves with in ecosystem ecology is the amount of energy that is secured by the primary producers and then is made available to the next level above it. And that energy transfer is actually very inefficient. Only about 10% of energy gets passed up the food chain from one level to the next. So if you have 1,000,000 joules of sunlight, the plants are only able to convert about 10,000, are able to make available 10,000 joules of that original 1,000,000 joules of energy, which, as you see, then 10% of that gets passed up to the primary consumer. Only 10% of that then goes to the secondary consumer, and only 10% of that, until you only have 10 joules of energy, to the tertiary consumer. It's why it takes, when we have this tertiary consumer or top predator, it takes a whole lot of robust representation in the lower levels of the food chain in order to support one top predator, top consumer, tertiary consumer. It is when you think of, you know, how much energy it takes in plants to support this, even though the snake isn't eating plants, but as far as being the base of the food chain to support that snake, it's why we have so many plants, so many of these primary producers in relation to top consumers, or why we have so many primary producers in relation to primary consumers, because there is this inefficient transfer of energy from one level, the lower level, up to the next. And it's often why you see these energy transfer constructs represented in this triangular type of fashion, because that is how it is most represented as far as that inefficient transfer of energy. Now, a concept to that as far as how these ecosystems function and how they work, we need a little bit of background here. You have what we have in ecosystems in order them to function properly. As a term we refer to as biogeochemical cycling in an ecosystem. So what does that mean? And if we break that term down, you have bio, or the living components of an ecosystem, geo, or the rock, the sediments, and then different chemicals, atoms and molecules and nutrients that cycle through an ecosystem. And they cycle in living matter and non-living components. And you have this delicate balance of all of these representatives in a healthy ecosystem. The lithosphere, that's your rock, your sediment. The atmosphere is the air around us. The hydrosphere is all of the water around us. And then the biosphere is considered the living organisms. We're going to use these terms throughout the next few slides. And so these elements, these components, are recycled continuously through the living and the non-living components of any given healthy ecosystem. And you'll see that if there is an imbalance, that ecosystem can quickly become unhealthy. So some of these biogeochemical cycles, of course, there are numerous ones. We're just going to hit some of the highlights here. Now, if you've taken environmental science or environmental biology already, you'll see a bit of overlap, and that is okay, because there are ecology concepts in environmental science science concepts in ecology, so forth and so on. So we'll first look at the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is our friend, just like so many molecules, so many atoms. And why we need nitrogen, I say we as living things, it's not just humans. Nitrogen is found in our DNA. That is the blueprint of what makes us, deoxyribonucleic acids, our RNA, more of our blueprint that makes us, and frogs. All different proteins, I should say. If a job needs to be done in a living organism, it's almost always done by a protein. The proteins that make up your muscles, the proteins that make up your hair, the proteins that make up your fingernails, proteins that make up hormones, these all contain nitrogen. So nitrogen is important for so many reasons. Now, nitrogen, how it cycles in around an ecosystem and how it cycles through biogeochemical cycling, is the most nitrogen is actually found in our atmosphere. The air around us contains all kinds of nitrogen. In fact, there's more nitrogen in our atmosphere than there is oxygen. And that's, one might say, well, there you go, that's how we get it. We breathe it in from the air around us. And actually, nitrogen that we breathe in, we cannot use. And so we have to get it some other way, not by breathing. The nitrogen in the air is a really big molecule and pretty much unusable. And so that nitrogen needs to be broken down. And one really cool way it gets broken down is by lightning. That's why you see a lightning strike here. So lightning breaks up big nitrogen molecules, breaks it down, and it can fall to the ground in precipitation events. It can get kind of lapped into the soil just from atmospheric nitrogen. And even if it's broken down by lightning, it is still not able to be used by us or by other living things. And so what you have is you have bacteria that's in the soil whose job is to break down large molecules of nitrogen into a usable form. They break it down into a sort of an ammonia compound, actually, and that is the form that is uptaken by the roots of plants. And the plants then take this nitrogen up in this ammonia type of molecule, and they are able to rearrange all of those atoms in that molecule, and they're able to put it into their own tissues. How do animals then get nitrogen, including us? We eat those plants and we digest those plants that tease out the nitrogen that we need, and then we can use that nitrogen to make our DNA, our RNA, and our proteins. And so how then does nitrogen continue on this cycle? Well, nitrogen gets returned to the soil when you have something decay, releasing nutrients back into the soil, whether they're animals or plants that die and release nitrogen back into the soil. But then the nitrogen has to return back to the atmosphere, and it doesn't return back into the atmosphere in the form of the decaying organic matter. You have different types of bacteria and fungi that actually build nitrogen back to their original form. Gaseous nitrogen, the big molecule that we can't directly use, that then dissipates back into the atmosphere. That is really pretty cool, isn't it? So you have nitrogen in the air, it gets broken down by lightning, also gets broken down by bacteria in the soil, plants uptake it, we eat the plants, or then animals eat the animals that eat the plants, and we digest that material. Animals digest that material and can use that nitrogen that way. Through decay of dead organic matter, it gets returned to the soil, and then you have different types of bacteria and fungi that build that nitrogen back up into a form that gets released back into the atmosphere. Now, as far as disruptions in the nitrogen cycle, if you add too much nitrogen into the nitrogen cycle, it really messes things up. And how have we done this? Well, we know that plants, in order to grow, need nitrogen in the soil in a usable form, and it is in very limited supply. In fact, it's referred to as a limiting nutrient. And we learned a while ago that you can make plants grow better if you added more nitrogen to the soil through, fertilizers. And for a long time, we used natural fertilizers, like manure from animals, for instance, contains natural fertilizers. But then around World War II, a little after World War II, we learned how to make nitrogen fertilizer out of petrochemicals. And so we started adding a lot of fertilizers, a lot of nitrogen-based fertilizers to the soil en masse over large agricultural regions. And while this has been beneficial to crops, unfortunately, there's been like way too much added to the nitrogen cycle that we've created. It's not part of the natural cycle. All of this nitrogen, the biogeochemical cycles are kind of like, we're cool. We've got enough nitrogen now, but there's way too much. And what can happen is with this application of fertilizers en masse, is it can run off into waterways, and the plants that live in waterways, the algae that grows there, the phytoplankton that lives there, now has this excess nitrogen, and it starts growing and growing and growing uncontrolled, and you wind up with algae clogged waterways, which then can die off and rot and poison waterways. We see these large-scale eutrophication events, not only like in someone's farm pond, but in the Gulf of Mexico or very large commercial fishing areas where, like, well, the Gulf of Mexico, you have the Mississippi River draining the entire Midwestern region, a big agricultural area of all these excess nitrogen fertilizers, dumping all this nitrogen into the Gulf of Mexico, and right at the Gulf of Mexico, you wind up having these dead zones with all this dead algal material. And dead zones called that because when you have all that algae that then dies off and decays, it takes up all the excess dissolved oxygen surrounding it, and the animals that depend upon dissolved oxygen to live, that breathe with gills, like fish, those animals don't survive, and then you wind up having fish die-offs and disruptions of millions and millions of dollars, if not billions, to commercial fishing industries along thousands of square miles. You also can have excess nitrogen released into the atmosphere by fossil fuel emissions, and this has been proven to acidify rain, water in clouds, and then fall as what we call acid rain, so that the precipitation is acidified and then is detrimental to plant growth. So yes, just some consequences of too much nitrogen in the nitrogen cycle. Phosphorus cycle is another good example of a biogeochemical cycle in ecosystems, and it does cycle between living and non-living, except the phosphorus cycle does not include the atmosphere. Now, phosphorus is great, and animals use it for their bones, for their teeth, their exoskeletons. At least some animals have exoskeletons, not insects, not bugs, and not like crabs and lobsters. That exoskeleton that they have is actually a sugar compound. I'm talking about like exoskeleton of clams and mussels and snails. That is made up of a lot of phosphorus. Phospholipids are a major component of the membranes of cells. So all kinds of uses that we have for phosphorus. So phosphorus is found in rock, and how it's released from rock is through weathering. You have different events like wind events, but mostly through precipitation events that wash phosphorus into the soil and also into the water. How then it's secured by something living is that it is, for the most part, it's uptaken by plants through their roots. You have phosphorus in the soil, it's uptaken by plants, and then the animal eats the plant, or an animal eats the animal that eats the plant. Now, you do have animals that directly eat rocks or chew on rocks for phosphorus. Some people might even take calcium/phosphorus supplements, which are basically rocks, really. This then winds up can go back into the phosphorus cycle by death, decaying plants and animals, can return to the water, can also precipitate back into rocks again. Too much phosphorus in the phosphorus cycle. Again, this is from fertilizers. This is from excess manure with factory farming. We see a lot of excess phosphorus. Detergents used to contain a lot of phosphorus, so we saw a lot of phosphorus spilling into waterways because of this. And this is another cause when it gets into the waterways of eutrophication events or excess algal growth. Come on, here we go. And the carbon cycle. Yes, we hear about this a lot because carbon is the atom that for life as we know it, now there sure could be lots of life living on other planets, not just in our galaxy, but galaxies far, far away. But life as we know it is carbon based on this planet. And so carbon pretty much defines something that is living or once was. Not everything with carbon means that it is alive, but nonetheless. So as far as a biogeochemical cycle is concerned, there is carbon in the atmosphere in gaseous form as far as carbon dioxide. And how this gets into something that is living, the air being non-living, is for the process of photosynthesis. That's pretty cool. In order to convert the sun's energy into glucose, photosynthetic organisms such as plants will take the sun's energy and some water and some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It goes through little pores in the leaf called stomata and rearrange all those atoms and come up with a glucose molecule, securing the carbon in that way. And then you can have carbon move onto animals by an animal eating that plant and securing carbon in that way. And then what happens then is carbon is released back into the atmosphere with those animals that undergo respiration, because people do it, and many other animals do it, is they breathe oxygen in, and when they exhale, they're exhaling carbon dioxide. So we breathe that oxygen back out into the atmosphere. Or plants will go through stages throughout the day where they will release carbon dioxide. Now, usually, or in a photosynthetic action, they're taking carbon dioxide in and then releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. But plants do undergo respiration where they release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. But what happens when plants and animals die? They release carbon into the soil. Now, when as well as all their other nutrients. And over millions of periods of time, these can turn into what we call fossil fuels, like coal and oil and natural gas. Get to that in just a moment. You also have the ocean absorbing some carbon. So there is your carbon cycle. It's too much carbon in the carbon cycle. And once again, it's due to human activity. When we dig up these fossil fuels and then we burn them, we're releasing lots of carbon into the atmosphere. Now, the role of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is that it helps keep our planet warm. It's a heat absorber. There are other heat absorbing molecules in our atmosphere. Water vapor is one of them, methane is another. But carbon dioxide its role in the atmosphere is to hold on to heat. And so the more carbon dioxide we're releasing into the atmosphere, the warmer our planet can get, and it's proven to have led to climate disruptions as far as excess carbon in our atmosphere. There's more carbon in our atmosphere than ever before. Excess carbon actually gets into the ocean and causes ocean acidification, and unfortunately we're seeing the effects of that on animals as well. So some other kind of bits and pieces here as far as ecosystems and ecosystem ecology is that healthy ecosystems are what make the planet function as a whole. And where you have a problem is if an ecosystem becomes disrupted or becomes non-functioning, or at least sick, functioning in a bad way. Because just like we have a heart and a liver and lungs, etc., and a brain that all work together to form a healthy individual, we have all of our ecosystems on our planet that are working together to form a healthy planet. And when one ecosystem gets unhealthy, that can have an effect on a healthy planet. overall. And if we really want to get real here, this is kind of what this is really important to us. We're invested in having our planet be healthy and keeping our ecosystems healthy, because ecosystems provide a habitable planet. But, we're going to dig a little deeper here. Ecosystems are a good moneymaker. Ecosystems allow us to live here, but they also provide goods and services that we could not live without, and also make our life comfortable, or I should say the kind of life that we have grown to know and to love. Now, ecosystems provide goods and services to humankind. Trillions of dollars, I've heard anywhere from 30 trillion to 60 trillion dollars of goods and services every single year, without, as you see there, without sending humans a bill. So it is up to us to keep our ecosystems healthy in order to allow us to continue existing here. So even though maybe you live in the middle of New York City or Philadelphia and you say, well, I don't ever get out into nature. If it weren't for wetlands, you would not be able to exist on our planet, even if you don't think that you directly benefit from a wetland ecosystem. So what are some of these goods and services that healthy ecosystems provide? Table 3.2, and then the table after this. So much stuff that healthy ecosystems do for us. Gas regulation, as far as atmospheric gases, climate regulation, disturbance regulation, as far as flood control, drought recovery, storm protection, water regulation, maintaining fresh water available for our planet. Water supply, storage and retention of water, erosion control and sediment retention. You have a healthy ecosystem, it will control erosion and will retain sediments. Again, unhealthy ecosystems don't do this. Healthy ecosystems do. Soil formation. This is something that nature does all by itself. And I know it's like, well, I can buy a bag of soil at Lowe's or Home Depot, but nature does this all on her own in almost all areas of the world. Nutrient cycling, like we just talked about. Waste treatment. Nature takes care of kind of all these organic matters and through decay and breakdown, as well as purifying water and keeping nature clean. Nature can do this herself. Well, we're not helping any. If it weren't for us kind of really muddling up the works, nature could do it all of herself, but we are really making it difficult for her. Pollination. Oh my gosh, in most regions of the world, we're living in an age of flowering plants. Nature provides pollination services. Humans, can they be clever enough if we lose our bees and our other pollinators, our bats, our birds, and our other pollinating insects? Probably not. Nature does this all on her own. Biological control, as far as keystone predators, we learned about that. Refugium, for nursery habitat for migratory species, regional habitats, overwintering grounds. Food production, this one, of course, lots of natural foods that we've kind of cleverly learned to selectively breed plants for food sources. But food production is one of a service that's provided by healthy ecosystems. Raw materials for all, not all, because we have plastic now, but so much stuff that we use for building materials, lumber, fuel, fodder, comes from nature. Genetic resources. We haven't tapped into the genetic resources of so many plants as far as medicines, material science, plant pathogen, crop pests, ornamental species, and all of that. And then, hey, recreation, healthy ecosystems. You go hiking, fishing, hunting, you go to the beach, just go traveling. These are, ecotourism is big. These are only possible if we keep our ecosystems healthy. And then there's a cultural, aesthetic aspect to healthy ecosystems. Aesthetic, artistic, educational, spiritual, and the scientific values of ecosystems, some that are a little less tangible or a little harder to put a exact dollar figure on, as far as the cultural reverence that we give to some aspects of our healthy ecosystems, but nonetheless extremely important concept in ecology. An ecosystem ecologist is, you are an ecosystem ecologist and you are studying ecosystems and how they work and how to restore them. But there's a great deal of art to that science, that you're doing something for the greater good is a much direct line here, as far as you're preserving cultures as well as just life in general. On that note, it's a little bit shorter than last week, but that wraps up ecosystem ecology. Ecosystem ecology in a nutshell talked about how ecosystems work, energy transfer in an ecosystem, primary productivity, some biogeochemical cycling, and then the concept of ecosystem capital. All right, hope everyone is well. Take care. Any questions? Put it in the comments, the discussion, and hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye.